But then the winds they blew, and the sands began to dance.
What if I told you that medieval villages were not built haphazardly, but according to a strict plan that saved millions of lives? These settlements, which at first glance appear to be simple clusters of huts, were in fact engineering masterpieces created for one purpose: survival in harsh conditions. Every turn of the path, every location of a house relative to its neighbor was calculated for maximum efficiency to protect people from cold, hunger, and natural disasters. Medieval people could not afford architectural extravagances, as any miscalculation in planning could lead to the destruction of the entire community during the long, cold winter. This is the whole truth about construction in those days, which we often overlook, admiring only castles and cathedrals. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how ancient wisdom helped people survive in harsh conditions, as well as the true cost of simply building a roof over their heads. I discovered this by accident. It turned out that the most common village layout was not just a random cluster, but a precise blueprint for survival. Most medieval settlements in Northern Europe were built in a so-called clustered or crowded type, where houses were tightly packed together. This was a deliberate architectural decision aimed at conserving heat in conditions of scarce building materials in a harsh climate. The tightly packed buildings reduced the total surface area exposed to wind and frost, creating an effective collective windbreak. In this way, a neighbor's house became, in effect, an additional outer wall, helping to conserve precious heat in the harsh winter cold. In addition, such dense construction minimized the distance that residents had to travel to perform their daily tasks. Every minute saved on traveling between the house, the well, and the communal oven was important, especially in the short winter daylight hours and low temperatures. The social contract of survival required that every villager be within easy reach to help a neighbor in case of fire or sudden illness. It was not just architecture, it was architecture that dictated the rules of coexistence and mutual assistance, without which the community could not have survived for long. The streets in such villages were often narrow and winding, which also had practical significance. They served as an additional barrier to the spread of strong winds that could cool down houses or fan a small fire into a destructive blaze. In addition, the narrow passages created natural shade in the summer, which helped to keep the houses cool and prevent overheating, providing relative comfort.
I think it's sturdy.
This network of narrow alleys was also more convenient for defense, as it allowed a small group of defenders to effectively control the movement of potential uninvited guests. The boundaries between private and public spaces were clearly defined, which was key to making the most of every inch of land. There was no room for unnecessary fences or useless decorative elements. Every stone and every branch was used to maximum effect. The density of the settlement meant that space for gardens and outbuildings was strictly limited, and this space was used wisely, usually immediately behind the house next to the back wall. This simplified the process of storing equipment and providing quick access to it, which was also part of the overall system of rational use of resources. Clustered planning also facilitated collective construction and repair. When houses are close together, their shared walls can be erected by the entire community at the same time, which significantly speeds up the process. For example, when building a new house, it was easier for neighbors to pass logs and clay to each other, working shoulder to shoulder on a common project. In such a system, everyone knew perfectly well that the help they gave today would be returned to them tomorrow when it was time to repair their own roof or patch up a wall. Despite its apparent simplicity, the location of houses often depended on the topography, which added an element of natural engineering. In hilly areas, houses were built in steps so that each subsequent house protected the previous one from the wind, functioning as a series of terraces. This technique also helped to avoid the accumulation of rainwater and melted snow by directing the flow along strictly defined channels, preventing the foundations from flooding. The clever use of slopes helped to solve the drainage problem, which was incredibly acute for adobe and wooden buildings. The organization of land plots also dictated the shape of the village. Houses were located in the center of cultivated land to minimize travel time to fields, which were often located on the outskirts. This reduction in the transport costs of energy and time was critical during the sowing and harvesting seasons, when every minute counted. Proximity to the fields meant that peasants could make the most of daylight hours for work, returning to the warm settlement only to sleep. The constant proximity of people in a densely built-up village also had psychological significance. In the conditions of constant threat and instability of the Middle Ages, close proximity provided a sense of security and community. Even the sounds of everyday life coming from neighbors served as a kind of confirmation that the community was alive and functioning, reducing anxiety. It was not only physical, but also mental protection that cluster development provided. Thus, the medieval village was not just a collection of individual houses, but a unified, heat-saving, and self-sufficient mechanism. Its layout was the result of centuries of trial and error aimed at achieving maximum energy efficiency and safety at minimum cost. Each resident was part of this mechanism, where their personal home played the role of a small but necessary cog in the overall system of survival. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on other studies of everyday life and survival. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about the role of collective intelligence in the layout of medieval settlements? And which of these reasons do you think is the most important? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how houses were built to survive centuries of cold and damp? The main line of defense against the elements began with the walls, and here medieval builders showed remarkable rationality, choosing materials not for their beauty, but for their ability to retain heat and resist moisture. The most common technique was half-timbered construction, where a sturdy wooden frame was filled with cheaper and more readily available materials. Woven panels were placed in a frame made of solid oak or ash beams, which were then coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. This mixture, known as adobe or cob, was an ideal insulator, available almost everywhere. The straw integrated into the clay created thousands of air pockets that slowed heat transfer and prevented the house from cooling down quickly. Clay, with its high thermal inertia, heated slowly from the hearth and released heat just as slowly, acting as a natural heat accumulator. This material was, in essence, a primitive but extremely effective alternative to modern insulation boards. The choice of wood for the frame was also a matter of survival. Wood with a high tannin content, most often oak, which was resistant to rot and pests, was used for posts and beams. The service life of such a frame could reach hundreds of years, which was incredibly important for the stability of a community that did not have the resources for constant major repairs. The use of such durable species ensured that future generations could live in these houses, only renewing the filling of the walls. The thickness of the walls was another element that determined the quality of life. In northern regions, the walls were made as thick as possible to ensure not only strength, but also better insulation, sometimes up to half a meter. The thicker the clay or stone wall, the longer the house remained cool in summer and warm in winter, smoothing out sharp changes in outside temperature. This was passive climate control based on simple physics and local materials. Windows, which are the weakest point of any wall in terms of heat loss, were made as small as possible to minimize their negative impact. They were often located on the south side to make the most of the scarce winter sun to heat the room and provide minimal lighting. Glass was a luxury, so windows were covered with wooden shutters, oiled parchment, or even animal bladders, which let light in but kept the heat out. Foundations, if any, were also built with a practical purpose in mind: to keep moisture away from the base of the walls. Most often it was simply stone or cobblestone masonry without mortar, which raised the wooden frame above ground level. This prevented direct contact between the wood and the damp soil, slowing down the rotting process and extending the life of the entire structure for many years. If no foundation was built, the lower logs were replaced regularly to prevent moisture from destroying the entire structure. The roof was no less important, as up to a third of all heat was lost through it. It was made very steep and high, covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds.
Push!
A straw roof, laid in a layer half a meter thick, was a fantastic insulator, as the air trapped between the stalks created a powerful thermal barrier. The steeper the roof slope, the faster rainwater and melted snow rolled off it, preventing sagging and leaks. The principle used in the construction of the house is what we would today call modularity. First, the frame was erected, then it was filled in, and finally the roof was installed. This approach made it easy to replace damaged sections of the walls without dismantling the entire house, which was very convenient given the limited resources and tools available. Repairs could be carried out by a single family in a couple of days, which was important in the event of sudden damage. All materials for building a house were sourced within a radius of no more than 5 kilometers from the village. Wood from the nearest forest, clay from the river floodplain, straw from their own fields. It was a closed, local production cycle. This principle of locality not only made the process cheaper, but also ensured that the materials were perfectly suited to the local climate and soil. Thus, the walls and roof of a medieval house were the result of a complex, albeit intuitive, calculation for survival. It was not just protection from the rain, but a carefully thought-out system of heat conservation and moisture removal. But knowing how to build walls does not explain the most important thing. How did the peasants cope with the severe frosts when even thick walls did not help? In the next chapter, you will learn how an ordinary stove or hearth could serve not only for cooking, but also as a mechanism for collective survival. The secret that people paid thousands for, and in the Middle Ages, entire villages, is the stove, which was not just a place to cook food, but a real survival machine. The hearth, located in the center of the house or attached to it, was a key element in the struggle for warmth, and its design was brought to pragmatic perfection. The first hearths were simply depressions in the earthen floor, but over time they evolved into massive stone or clay ovens. Clay stoves, or so-called Russian stoves in their later form, were huge structures made of materials with high heat capacity. After the wood burned out, these structures retained heat for a day, slowly and evenly releasing it into the house. This allowed for the conservation of scarce fuel, as it was not necessary to constantly add wood to maintain the temperature. It was sufficient to heat the stove only once or twice a day. The location of the stove in the house was also part of a rational survival plan. It was often placed against an interior wall so that the heat could be distributed to several rooms at once if the house was divided by partitions. In the simplest huts, the stove stood right in the middle of the only room, and its hot mass served as a source of heat for all the inhabitants who gathered around it at night. In multifunctional buildings, the stove could even heat the adjacent barn, thus preserving the livestock. The smoke from the hearth, which today seems to us to be a sign of poor ventilation, was actually used rationally. In the most primitive houses, the so-called smoke houses, the smoke had no direct outlet and accumulated under the roof. It settled on logs and straw, creating a thin layer of soot, which served as an additional, albeit highly questionable, preservative for wood, protecting it from moisture and pests. But even more important was the collective use of ovens. In large villages, there were often one or more communal ovens where the entire community took turns baking bread. This saved fuel that would otherwise have had to be used by each household separately. The burning communal oven also served as a gathering place where residents exchanged news and planned their work together, strengthening social ties. Anything that could be obtained was used as fuel for these ovens. Brushwood, fallen trees, peat, or even dry manure in treeless regions. Firewood was so highly valued that illegal logging in communal forests was severely punished, as it was a matter of survival for the entire settlement. Careful management of forest resources made it possible to avoid catastrophic fuel shortages during particularly cold winters, when firewood became as valuable as gold. In cases where the hearth was open, a pot for cooking was suspended above it. An open fire provided a direct, quick source of heat necessary for the rapid preparation of porridge and soups. In addition, an open fire also served as a source of light, replacing expensive candles and oil lamps, which was another part of the overall economy. The heat from the massive stove was used not only to warm people, but also to dry things. Wet clothes, collected herbs, grain, and even fishing nets were hung over the stove. This was critically important in conditions of high humidity and dampness, as dry clothes and food were essential for health and continued work. Thus, the stove was not just a household item, but a central element of the medieval survival system. It combined the functions of heating, cooking, and preserving materials, and was a symbol of the hearth and community stability. Its design was a direct response to the challenges of climate and poverty. If you think the rationality of medieval inhabitants exceeded all expectations, then like this video to support our research. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Guess what happened next after the house was built, and how planning the territory beyond it ensured food security. The layout of a medieval village was inextricably linked to the organization of the surrounding fields, and this connection was the basis of agricultural logistics. The main land use system was the open field system, in which all cultivated land was divided into 2 or 3 huge fields, and these fields in turn into many narrow strips. The rationality of this system lay in its egalitarian approach to land distribution and risk minimization. Each peasant farm received several strips in each large field, located in different parts of it. This meant that if one part of the field was damaged by hail, drought, or flooding, the rest of the peasants' land would remain intact. This distribution allowed the risk to be shared among all members of the community and prevented famine in the event of a local disaster. The fields themselves were located as close as possible to the village, forming concentric circles around the residential buildings. Immediately behind the houses, there were often small vegetable gardens where perishable crops such as cabbage, onions, and peas were grown. Further away were large communal fields followed by pastures and communal forests. This radial layout minimized travel time to the most intensively cultivated lands. The organization of crop rotation was a key element in this survival logistics. The 2 or 3 field system allowed the soil to rest without completely depleting it and ensured that there would be a harvest every year. In the 3 field system, one field was sown with winter crops, another with spring crops, and the third was left fallow to restore fertility. This was a natural biological way of maintaining fertility without the use of expensive fertilizers. The layout of the fields was also determined by the need to share draft animals, oxen and horses. Since plows were heavy and draft animals were expensive, farmers often plowed the land together, combining their resources and time. Long, narrow strips of land were optimal for turning the plow and saved the strength of the animals, which was an incredibly important resource in the spring. The open field system required all villagers to strictly adhere to sowing and harvesting deadlines, which strengthened community discipline. It was impossible to start or finish work before your neighbor, as all the boundaries between the strips were open and livestock could stray onto someone else's territory. It was a harsh but necessary system that guaranteed order and fairness in the distribution of labor and harvest. Between the fields and the village, there was often a communal pasture where livestock grazed. Livestock was a vital source of protein, leather, and draft power, and its survival was no less important than the harvest. The location of the pastures on the way to the fields also helped to fertilize the land naturally, as the livestock passed through them every day, which was also part of agricultural rationality. The narrow strips of land, which might seem irrational in terms of area, were in fact dictated by the tools available in the type of soil. The narrow strip allowed the farmer to work the land faster and not waste extra energy turning a heavy plow. This was a direct consequence of technological limitations, which required the most careful use of human labor. Thus, the layout of the fields around the village was no less rational than the layout of the houses themselves. It was aimed at spreading risks, maintaining fertility, and making the most of collective labor. Agricultural logistics was the foundation on which the entire community life was based. How do you think the peasants coped with terrible weather if their fields were so far from the village? In the next chapter, you will learn why the choice of location for the village was more important than the house itself. Medieval inhabitants knew that even the strongest house was worthless if it was built in the wrong place. So choosing a site for a settlement was the first and most important strategic decision. The ideal location had to provide 3 key factors for survival: access to clean water, protection from the elements, and proximity to fertile land. Any village that prospered was built in a location that gave it undeniable natural advantages. Most settlements were located near rivers, streams, or reliable underground water sources. Water was needed not only for drinking and cooking, but also for animals and for commercial needs such as washing wool or tanning leather. The lack of a constant and reliable source of water would mean a constant threat of drought and the inability to farm, so water was a key factor in determining location. To protect against sudden flooding and dampness, most houses were built on high ground or on a slight slope. This provided natural drainage and prevented the area from becoming waterlogged, which was critical for preserving wooden structures from rotting. Even a slight slope of a few degrees could save the entire village from flooding during spring floods or heavy rains. Wind protection also played a huge role in choosing a location. Villages were often nestled against a forest, hill, or mountain ridge, which served as a natural barrier against prevailing cold winds. This reduced heat loss in homes and created a milder microclimate throughout the settlement. Sometimes a village was located in a hollow to use the surrounding hills as wind protection. The orientation of the village to the cardinal points was another element of rational planning. Whenever possible, the settlement was located on a southern slope to maximize sunlight and heat during the day. The sun not only helped to heat the houses, but also dried the wet ground, which reduced humidity and the risk of diseases associated with dampness. The raw material base also influenced the choice. Proximity to a forest, which provided construction timber and fuel, or to quarries, which provided stone for foundations, was a huge advantage. Every kilometer that did not have to be traveled to deliver heavy materials was a saved resource that could be spent on something else. This saved human effort and time. In more dangerous times, villages could be located in naturally protected places, on river bends, on islands surrounded by swamps, or on the tops of steep hills. Although this made daily life more difficult, with all the climbing and descending, it gave an advantage in the event of a surprise attack. In such places, every element of the landscape was used as part of the defense. Despite all the difficulties, the chosen location had to be suitable for agriculture, because without fertile land, the community was doomed to starvation. They chose areas with a sufficiently deep and rich humus layer that could be cultivated with the tools available at the time. Rocky or overly sandy soil, even with the presence of water and forests, made a place unsuitable for long-term settlement. Thus, the location of a medieval village was the result of a multifactorial analysis. It was not a random choice, but a well-thought-out strategic decision in which natural resources and topography were put at the service of survival. The community's ability to survive for the next few centuries depended on it. Want to learn a secret that will change your life? And how medieval inhabitants solved a problem that is worth billions today? Water management? The central well or water source was the most important point in the village, and its location was determined not only by convenience, but also by safety and hygiene considerations, as far as possible at that time. The well was always located at the highest point of the settlement or away from residential buildings to avoid contamination. The direction of surface water runoff was key as it determined where waste and rainwater would go. Drainage ditches and ditches, which often surrounded the village or ran through its streets, were designed to carry dirty water downhill, away from the drinking water source. These ditches were a primitive but necessary sewage system that protected the community from dampness and excess moisture. The construction of a well itself required enormous effort and special knowledge. The shaft was reinforced with stone or wooden logs to prevent collapse, and the upper part was surrounded by a high log structure with a roof. The roof protected the water from dust, debris, and rainwater, which could wash away dirt from the surface of the earth. The deeper and stronger the well, the more likely the village was to survive a drought. In places where it was not possible to dig a well, the inhabitants used springs, which were also carefully arranged. Stone walls were built around the spring, and the water collection area was lined with stones to prevent soil erosion and silting. The spring was considered a sacred place, and its purity was a matter of honor for the community, which also served practical hygiene purposes. The entire water use system was strictly regulated. There were special places for washing clothes, located downstream from the drinking water intake. Pollution of the common source was punishable because it threatened the survival of all. This discipline was introduced not for moral reasons, but for reasons of basic rationality and self-preservation. Solid household waste that was not reused was disposed of by creating compost piles. These piles were often located outside the residential area, but within reach of vegetable gardens, as humus was a valuable fertilizer. Thus, waste was not simply thrown away, but turned into a resource which was the height of practicality. Liquid waste, including sewage from domestic animals, was also used as fertilizer. A corner of the yard or barn was designed so that liquids would drain into a special pit, from where they could be collected for fertilizing fields. It was a closed, waste-free cycle, where every product of human activity found its rational use. Thus, water and waste management in a medieval village was primitive, but clearly structured. It was aimed at maximizing the purity of drinking water and reusing waste. It was a system dictated by limited resources and the need to survive in crowded conditions. But even the most rational house design won't save you from hunger if you don't have fuel for the stove. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how medieval people managed forest resources to keep warm. For a medieval village, the forest was not just a source of wood, but a vital energy reserve, and its management was a matter of strategic importance. Properly organized forest management ensured that all residents had fuel and building materials without destroying the forest itself. Communal forests, like fields, were collectively owned and used according to strict rules established centuries ago. The main strategy was so-called renewable forest use, or the slash and burn system. But a more common and sustainable method was clear cutting, or one-time felling. This method involved not cutting down trees completely, but cutting them at stump level so that they could sprout again. These sprouts, called layers, provided a large amount of brushwood and thin poles, which were ideal for weaving walls. Another important method was called high pruning, or pollarding, where the tree trunk was cut at a height of 2 to 3 meters. This technique yielded brushwood that was out of reach of grazing livestock and allowed the tree to continue growing. The cut branches provided fuel every year, and the tree itself continued to grow, ensuring a constant and renewable supply. Wood for the construction of large dwellings and farm buildings was selected very carefully and was strictly regulated. Old straight trees growing on communal land were cut down for beams and frames, and this was done only with the permission of the elders. Each resident was entitled to a certain amount of heavy firewood for building a house, but could not cut it thoughtlessly so as not to deplete the common fund. The collection of brushwood and fallen trees was, as a rule, free, and all members of the community were involved in this, especially children and the elderly, who were unable to do heavy work in the fields. Brushwood and dry branches gave off a lot of heat and burned quickly, which was convenient for daily cooking. It was a basic, constantly renewable source of fuel available to everyone. For iron forging, charcoal production, and other high-temperature needs, denser woods such as oak were used. These woods burned longer and produced more heat, which was necessary for the work of the village blacksmith. The blacksmith, who was critical to the production of tools, had special priority in obtaining quality fuel. Thus, forest resource management was a complex but necessary system that ensured long-term fuel security. Medieval peasants understood that the forest was a finite resource and that their survival depended on how wisely they managed it. Rationality in this matter was not a pipe dream, but a strict requirement of life. A medieval village could not be built by one person or even one family, so collective labor and mutual aid were the basis of the construction economy. The efficiency of construction depended directly on the speed of work, since the house had to be ready before the autumn rains or the first frost. This required not just participation, but clear organization and distribution of roles. When a new house was being built or an old one was being repaired in the village, the whole community came to help, which was called helping or toloka. It was believed that every resident should help their neighbor because sooner or later they would find themselves in the same situation. This principle of mutual assistance was an unwritten law that significantly reduced the financial and labor costs for individual families. The distribution of tasks was clear and rational. Men were engaged in cutting and delivering logs, erecting the frame and roof, using tools such as adzes, axes, and wedges. Lighter work, such as weaving wall panels and mixing clay with straw, was often done by women and teenagers. This specialization allowed each member of the community to make the most of their strengths. To lift heavy beams and rafters, they used simple but effective mechanisms: ropes, levers, and rolling logs. Without cranes, people relied on collective strength and the simplest laws of physics. A correctly calculated lever, operated by a dozen people, could lift a beam weighing several hundred kilograms. The speed of construction was determined not only by the need to finish before the cold weather set in, but also by the need to save time. The faster the house was built, the faster the family could return to work in the fields, which was their main source of livelihood. Thus, the construction process was compressed as much as possible so as not to distract the workforce from agricultural tasks. Payment for labor was not in money, which was often lacking, but in natural products. The owner of the new house treated all participants in the pomak to a hearty dinner and beer, which was part of a social ritual. Food and drink were a symbol of gratitude and served as an additional incentive for collective labor. When constructing public buildings such as churches, barns, or communal ovens, the principle of collective labor was even more pronounced. Each resident contributed their share of labor, materials, or money. The communal barn, for example, was built by the whole community, as it served to store common grain reserves in case of crop failure, which was an important element of food security. Traditional construction methods were passed down from generation to generation, ensuring uniformity and reliability in construction. There was no need for blueprints or written instructions. Everyone knew how to mix clay, how to cut logs, and how to lay straw on a roof. This transfer of knowledge was the cornerstone of construction logistics. The thoughtful layout of houses in a medieval village created an effect that we now call microclimate engineering, allowing maximum use of natural conditions for heating and protection. Peasants intuitively understood how wind and sun affected the temperature inside their homes and built their houses accordingly. It was a passive strategy that required no expense. As already mentioned, the houses were built very close to each other, but with the windrows in mind. Long rows of buildings were often positioned perpendicular to the direction of the main cold winds, creating a single continuous wall that dampened their force. This windbreak was so effective that the temperature in the center of the village could be several degrees higher than in the open field. In cases where the village was located on a slope, the houses were built in terraces, and each subsequent building protected the previous one from the wind, but did not block the sun. This allowed all houses to receive the maximum amount of heat from the winter sun, especially if their windows faced south. The shade from neighbors was minimal, and this was the result of a carefully thought-out plan. The entrances to the houses were often located on the leeward side to prevent cold air from entering directly when the door was open. Even a small space in front of the door, a kind of vestibule, could serve as a buffer to keep out the cold. It was a simple and effective solution that helped to keep the heat inside the house. Vegetation, especially old trees and shrubs that remained around the village, was also used as part of the wind protection system. Tall trees such as oaks and elms served as powerful natural barriers that broke up wind currents and created calmer areas. These trees were valued and protected because they played an important role in protecting the settlement. Blind walls, which had no windows, were often oriented to the north or in the direction of the prevailing cold winds. These walls, built of thicker and denser material, took the brunt of the elements, protecting the more fragile parts of the house. It was a distribution of load where each element of the building performed its protective function. The interior layout of the house was also dictated by the climate. Living quarters where people slept and spent most of their time often had no windows, and entrances were narrowed as much as possible to avoid drafts. This was a conscious sacrifice of light in favor of warmth, as the latter was much more important for survival. Thus, medieval microclimate engineering was the art of using natural factors. The rational placement of buildings, the use of topography, and even the remains of the forest created a unique warm zone that increased the community's chances of survival in harsh times. In addition to residential buildings and fields, medieval villages had public buildings that served not only as centers of worship or entertainment, but also as important structures in the survival system. The church and the community granary, as well as the tavern, usually occupied a central place, and their location was key to the overall rational layout. These buildings served as gathering points, shelters, and centers of community logistics. The church, as the most durable and often stone building in the village, served as a refuge during raids or severe natural disasters such as floods. Its thick walls and sturdy roof were the most reliable protection, and in a critical situation, the entire community could gather under its arches. Thus, the church was not only a spiritual anchor of security, but also a very physical one. Next to the church, there was often a communal granary or barn. Grain was the community's most valuable asset, and its storage required particularly sturdy buildings that were protected from moisture and pests. The barn, located in the center of the settlement, was under constant surveillance, and its supplies were strictly controlled in case of crop failure. It was insurance against famine. The tavern, or inn, also played an important role in the survival system, albeit not as obvious. It was not just a place to drink, but the main center for exchanging information, concluding deals, and resolving disputes. It was the only place where people from different social strata could meet in an informal setting, which contributed to social unity. The tavern often served as a place where travelers and merchants could spend the night, providing the village with a connection to the outside world and a flow of information. Guests brought with them news, new ideas, and goods, which was vital for an isolated community. It was a kind of information and economic hub. In addition, taverns, like churches, were often better heated than ordinary peasant houses and served as a place to warm up on particularly cold days. They were a kind of public living room that provided an opportunity to gather and discuss pressing issues without wasting precious fuel in every home. This was a rational economy. Public buildings were usually built in the central square, which also served as a market, a place for gatherings and celebrations. This square was the heart of community life, and its open space was important for maneuvering in case of fire or for trade. The location of all key points in one place simplified logistics and community management. Even the cemetery, which was located near the church, had practical significance. Its walls or fence often served as additional protection from the winter animals. The cemetery was part of the communal land, which was used for a specific purpose without taking up fertile land that was needed for agriculture. Thus, the church, barn, and tavern, as centers of social and spiritual life, were an integral part of the rational survival system of the medieval village. They provided security, food supplies, and social unity, without which the community could not function. We can see that the medieval village was not just a cluster of buildings, but a living, complex system, each element of which served a single purpose: the survival of the community in harsh and unpredictable conditions. Rationality was not an architectural style, but a strict requirement of life that dictated the density of construction, the choice of materials, and the organization of fields. From collective labor and proper management of forest resources to the location of the well and the communal oven, every detail was part of a large, intuitively thought-out plan. This architecture of survival is a testament to the remarkable ingenuity and resilience of people who were able to create stable settlements with minimal technology. Ultimately, their strategy showed that the strongest foundation is not stone, but a social contract and a collective understanding that individual survival is impossible without the survival of the entire community. They turned their weaknesses, poverty, scarcity, and harsh climate, into strengths by creating the most efficient and energy-saving living environment possible. Their legacy is a lesson in how to use resources and how important it is to plan not just for 1 year, but for centuries to come. Which of the rational strategies we have discussed, cluster housing for warmth, 3-field crop rotation, or communal forest management, do you think is the most ingenious and necessary for survival? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the architecture and everyday life of the past.